Sometimes the loudest moment of justice begins with the quietest humiliation. Emily Carter's hands trembled as she knelt on the polished marble floor of Briarwood Café, the late afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall front windows and turning the white tiles beneath her knees into mirrors of golden shadow. Around her, the soft clink of ceramic cups and low conversations continued as if nothing unusual were happening, but every eye in the room had slowly drifted toward the scene unfolding near the center tables. A dark streak of coffee ran across the floor and pooled near Emily's shoes, the result of a perfectly accidental spill just seconds earlier. Standing above her with a satisfied smile was Vanessa Blake, dressed in a cream designer jacket that probably cost more than Emily made in 2 months of working double shifts. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her perfectly styled hair catching the light as she glanced down at the stain on her expensive heels. "Well," she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables, "since you're already down there, you might as well clean my shoes too." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the room. Someone near the window lifted a phone just slightly, pretending to check messages while clearly recording. Emily lowered her eyes, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She had seen this look before, that same smug amusement Vanessa used back in high school hallways years ago, the same look that told everyone watching exactly who was meant to feel small in this moment. The cafe smelled of fresh espresso and warm pastries, but to Emily it suddenly felt like the air had grown thin and heavy. She reached for the napkin tucked into her apron pocket and began wiping the floor slowly, carefully, hoping that if she moved quickly enough the moment would pass and the whispers would stop. "Careful," Vanessa added with a playful sigh, shifting her foot just enough to nudge Emily's shoulder. "That marble is expensive." Another laugh rose from the nearby tables. Emily pressed the napkin against the spreading coffee stain, her fingers tightening as memories flickered through her mind, school lockers slammed shut, notebooks knocked from her arms, Vanessa's voice echoing down crowded hallways. Years had passed, yet somehow the balance of power still looked exactly the same. Outside the cafe windows, the city moved through its ordinary rhythm, taxis rolling past, pedestrians crossing under glowing streetlights, the distant hum of evening traffic building along the avenue. Inside, the golden lighting and elegant decor gave Briarwood Café the polished calm of a place designed for people who never worried about rent or tuition or the cost of next week's groceries. Emily kept her head down, focusing on the small circle of coffee she was cleaning, telling herself the same thing she had repeated every shift for the past 6 months, keep the job, finish the semester, don't make trouble. Vanessa folded her arms, watching with a kind of casual boredom that suggested she had all the time in the world. "You missed a spot," she said softly. The room grew quieter. Somewhere behind them, the cafe door opened with the soft chime of a bell, though almost no one noticed. Almost no one, except the man who had just stepped inside and stopped walking the moment he saw the girl kneeling on the marble floor. Emily Carter finished wiping the last thin streak of coffee from the marble floor, her fingers slightly numb from the pressure she had been using on the napkin, and slowly rose to her feet while keeping her eyes lowered, hoping the moment would dissolve into the background noise of the cafe the same way hundreds of uncomfortable moments had faded before in her life. The polished floor reflected the warm lights above, and for a brief second she could see her own reflection there, a young woman in a simple black apron, her brown hair tied back neatly, trying her best to look smaller than she felt. Vanessa Blake watched her with a smile that carried the effortless confidence of someone who had never worried about losing anything important. "You always were good at following instructions," Vanessa said softly, adjusting the gold bracelet around her wrist while the people seated nearby pretended not to stare. Emily placed the damp napkin into the small cleaning tray she carried and forced herself to breathe slowly, remembering the quiet apartment she shared with her mother on the west side of the city, remembering the late night studying for exams at the kitchen table while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Every shift at Briarwood Café was part of a careful balance she had been holding for years, working long hours, saving every possible dollar, and refusing to give anyone a reason to send her home early. Vanessa took a slow step closer, the soft click of her heels echoing across the marble floor, and Emily could feel the familiar weight of the past pressing against the present like a shadow that had never quite disappeared. Back in high school, Vanessa Blake had ruled the hallways with the same casual authority she carried now, surrounded by friends who laughed at the right moments and teachers who rarely noticed the quieter battles happening just beyond their view. Emily had learned early that silence could sometimes be the safest answer. A quiet voice from one of the tables broke the tension as a customer asked for a refill, and Emily instinctively reached for the coffee pot on the nearby service cart, grateful for the small interruption. She stepped away from Vanessa, focusing on the routine movements of her job, pouring the dark coffee carefully into a porcelain cup while the aroma drifted through the air. The cafe had always been a strange contrast to the rest of her life, with its tall glass windows, polished brass fixtures, and soft music playing overhead, a place where people came to relax without ever thinking about the effort it took to keep everything running smoothly. Vanessa remained where she stood, glancing around as if the room itself existed for her entertainment. "You should smile more, Emily," she added lightly. "Customers like friendly service." Emily nodded slightly, even though her chest felt tight. She had spent years teaching herself not to react, not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her frustration, and that discipline had carried her through countless moments like this one. Yet as she set the coffee pot back onto the cart and turned toward the service counter, she felt an unfamiliar awareness ripple through the room. Conversations had grown quieter. Chairs shifted subtly. It was the kind of silence that arrived when someone unexpected entered a space where people believed they understood the rules. Near the entrance of the cafe, the man who had stepped inside moments earlier stood perfectly still, observing the room with calm, unreadable focus. He was dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit him with effortless precision, the kind of quiet elegance that did not need to announce itself. His eyes moved slowly across the cafe before settling on the place where Emily and Vanessa had been standing only seconds earlier. The manager behind the counter noticed him at the same moment and suddenly straightened, his face draining of color as recognition replaced his usual professional composure. Something in the air shifted then, subtle but undeniable, like the first distant rumble before a storm that only a few people realized was approaching. The quiet shift in the atmosphere spread slowly through Briarwood Café like a ripple across still water, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it began. Emily Carter noticed it only as a faint pause in the rhythm of the room, the gentle murmur of conversations lowering just slightly while she placed a clean cup onto the service counter. She did not look toward the entrance yet. Years of working customer service had taught her that sometimes the safest choice was simply to keep moving, to stay focused on the small tasks directly in front of her. Behind the counter, Daniel Price stood unusually straight, his hands frozen for a brief second over the espresso machine before he forced himself to resume working. Anyone who knew him well would have recognized the tension immediately. Daniel rarely looked nervous. Yet now his eyes flickered toward the man near the door with unmistakable recognition. The man had not raised his voice or made any grand entrance. He had simply stepped inside and stopped walking, his calm presence drawing attention without effort. He was tall, perhaps a little over 6 feet, with dark hair brushed neatly back and the composed posture of someone who moved through the world with quiet certainty. The tailored black suit he wore seemed understated at first glance, but the cut and detail revealed the kind of craftsmanship that came from the finest designers in the city. His gaze moved slowly across the cafe, taking in every detail with patient observation, until his attention settled on Emily and Vanessa. Vanessa Blake noticed the shift in the room a moment later and turned slightly, following the direction of several curious glances. For the first time since she had walked in, her confident smile faded just enough to reveal a flicker of uncertainty. She did not recognize the man, but she could sense that others did. A couple seated near the window quietly stopped speaking. A businessman standing near the pastry display straightened his jacket and lowered his voice. Even the barista working the second espresso machine slowed his movements as if suddenly aware that the smallest sounds carried further than usual. Emily lifted the tray of freshly cleaned cups and turned back toward the dining area, unaware that the man's attention had not left her for several seconds. He watched the scene carefully, his expression unreadable, as if replaying what he had just witnessed in silence. The memory of Vanessa standing over Emily, the coffee spill on the marble floor, and the laughter that followed had unfolded only moments earlier, yet it seemed to linger in the air like an unfinished sentence. Vanessa regained her composure quickly and brushed an invisible speck from her sleeve, the gesture restoring the confidence she was accustomed to wearing. Honestly, she said lightly to no one in particular, though her voice carried clearly through the quiet room, some people just never learn how to move on from high school. The remark was meant to sound casual, but the words drifted toward Emily's ears like a familiar echo from another time. Emily paused for half a second beside a nearby table, steadying the tray in her hands, before continuing toward the service station. She did not respond. She rarely did. What she did not know was that the man standing near the entrance had already taken his first step forward, his polished shoes moving across the marble floor with deliberate calm. Daniel Price noticed immediately and felt his stomach tighten. He understood something that most of the room did not yet realize. When Adrian Romano began walking toward someone, it usually meant that whatever had just happened in that room was about to matter far more than anyone expected. Adrian Romano walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to rush toward anything in his life, each step across the marble floor measured and calm, yet somehow drawing the attention of nearly everyone in Briarwood Café without a single word being spoken. Emily Carter did not notice him at first. She had reached the service counter and was carefully aligning a stack of porcelain cups onto the polished surface, focusing on the simple rhythm of her work as if the quiet tension in the room had nothing to do with her. Vanessa Blake, however, noticed the movement immediately. Her eyes followed the tall figure approaching from across the cafe, curiosity replacing the slight irritation she had been wearing only moments earlier. The man stopped a few feet away from where Vanessa stood, his gaze steady and composed, the soft lighting of the cafe reflecting subtly along the clean lines of his dark suit. For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough for several nearby conversations to fade completely. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying him with the casual confidence of someone who was used to meeting strangers who admired her. "Can I help you?" she asked with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Adrian Romano did not answer immediately. Instead, his attention shifted briefly toward the faint coffee stain that still lingered along the marble floor near the table where the earlier scene had unfolded. Then his eyes moved to Emily, who was still standing at the counter with her back partly turned, unaware that the quiet center of the room had shifted toward her again. Daniel Price stepped out from behind the counter quickly, his movements far more careful than usual. "Good afternoon, Mr. Romano," he said, his voice controlled but noticeably respectful. The words seemed to ripple through the room with quiet recognition. Vanessa blinked once, the name clearly unfamiliar to her but meaningful to others around her. The businessman near the pastry display suddenly straightened his posture. A woman seated near the window lowered her phone slightly, her expression changing as realization spread across her face. Adrian Romano acknowledged the manager with a small nod before returning his attention to Vanessa. Up close, his expression remained calm, though there was something deliberate in the way he studied the situation before speaking. "I arrived a moment ago," he said evenly, his voice quiet yet carrying clearly through the room. "Just in time to see something interesting." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, still unaware of the significance behind the name Daniel had spoken. "Well, you probably misunderstood," she replied with a casual laugh. "The staff here are just doing their jobs." Adrian's gaze shifted once more toward Emily, who finally turned slightly after hearing the exchange behind her. For the briefest moment their eyes met, and Emily felt a strange sense that the man standing across the room had seen far more than she wished anyone had noticed. Adrian looked back at Vanessa again, the calm expression on his face unchanged. "Yes," he said slowly. "I noticed someone doing their job." His eyes lowered for a second toward Vanessa's polished heels before lifting again. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself, as if everyone present sensed that whatever Adrian Romano was about to say next would change the direction of the entire afternoon. Emily Carter felt the weight of the room settle around her the moment Adrian Romano finished speaking. She had not intended to become part of the conversation again, yet somehow the quiet gravity of his presence had drawn the moment back toward her like a tide returning to shore. She stood beside the service counter with both hands resting lightly on the edge, trying to appear calm even though her thoughts were moving quickly beneath the surface. Vanessa Blake gave a small laugh, brushing her hair over one shoulder as though the situation had already grown tiresome. "If you saw something interesting, then you probably saw a misunderstanding," she said lightly, her tone smooth and dismissive. "She works here. Cleaning up spills is literally her job." Several people in the cafe shifted slightly in their seats. Some avoided looking at anyone directly, while others watched with open curiosity. The warm glow of the hanging lights reflected off the polished marble floor, illuminating the faint mark where the coffee had been wiped away minutes earlier. Adrian Romano's eyes moved slowly across the floor for a moment before returning to Vanessa. His expression remained composed, but there was a quiet patience in his gaze that made the silence around them feel heavier with every second that passed. Daniel Price stood a few steps behind the counter, his hands clasped together as if resisting the urge to intervene. He understood that interrupting now would only make things worse. Vanessa seemed unaware of the tension building around her. She shifted her weight slightly, her heel clicking softly against the marble. "Look," she continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable while still being heard by those closest to the scene, "I did not mean anything by it. Some people are just a little too sensitive." Emily kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the small reflection of the cafe lights along the counter's polished edge. She had heard variations of that sentence many times before. It was the kind of explanation that always arrived after. The laughter had faded. Adrian Romano took another step forward, closing the small distance between himself and Vanessa. His movement was calm, deliberate, and completely unhurried. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the quiet cafe with effortless clarity. "Sensitivity is not the problem," he said. Vanessa frowned slightly, as if trying to decide whether she should be annoyed or amused. Adrian's gaze shifted toward Emily for a brief moment before returning to Vanessa again. "Respect," he continued evenly, "is something people either understand or they do not." The statement lingered in the air between them. A customer near the window slowly lowered his coffee cup. Another guest quietly set down her phone, suddenly more interested in the unfolding exchange than whatever she had been recording before. Vanessa crossed her arms again, her confidence returning in a familiar defensive rhythm. "You are making this sound much more serious than it actually is," she replied. Adrian Romano looked at her steadily, the calm expression on his face unchanged. Then his eyes lowered once more to the polished shoes Vanessa wore, the same shoes that had hovered over the coffee spill only minutes earlier. For a moment he said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough for the entire room to feel it. Then, in a voice as calm as the quiet before a storm, Adrian Romano finally spoke again. The silence inside Briarwood Café stretched so long that even the soft music playing through the ceiling speakers seemed to fade into the background. Adrian Romano's eyes remained on Vanessa Blake's polished shoes for a moment before he slowly lifted his gaze again. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear, yet it carried across the room with quiet authority. "Clean her shoes." The words were simple, almost casual, and for half a second Vanessa smiled as if she believed she had just gained an unexpected ally. She turned her head slightly toward Emily with a satisfied expression, clearly expecting the scene to repeat itself. "See?" Vanessa said lightly, lifting her chin. "Even he understands how things work." Emily felt a sudden wave of embarrassment tighten her chest again. She had just begun to believe the moment might finally be over. The cafe remained silent, the entire room holding its breath as the meaning of Adrian's words hovered in the air. Then Adrian Romano spoke again, his voice still calm but unmistakably precise. "I was not speaking to her." The sentence landed like a quiet echo across the marble floor. Vanessa's smile faltered as confusion flickered across her face. Adrian did not raise his voice. He simply looked directly at her and repeated the instruction with the same steady tone. "You should clean her shoes." For a moment Vanessa did not move. The confident posture she had worn since entering the cafe seemed to lose its balance as the realization slowly reached her. A few customers exchanged glances. Someone near the back of the room shifted in their chair. Daniel Price watched the scene unfold with a tight expression, knowing exactly how quickly the situation had just changed. Vanessa let out a short laugh, the sound uncertain now rather than amused. "You are joking," she said, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to confirm it. Adrian Romano did not smile. "No," he replied quietly. The word was delivered without emotion, yet it carried a certainty that made several people straighten in their seats. Vanessa's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel behind the counter. "Is this some kind of prank?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead he stepped forward slightly, his voice careful but respectful. "Miss Blake," he said, "you may want to listen." Vanessa's confidence began to slip. She looked back at Adrian Romano, studying him more carefully now as if trying to understand why the room had suddenly turned against her. His expression remained composed, patient, almost indifferent. "You humiliated someone in front of an entire room," Adrian said evenly. "You treated her work like it made her smaller than you." The cafe remained completely silent. Even the barista had stopped moving. Adrian continued, his voice still steady. "If you believe cleaning someone's shoes is appropriate treatment for another person, then it should not trouble you to do it yourself." Vanessa stared at him, stunned by the unexpected reversal. Emily Carter stood frozen beside the counter, unsure whether she should speak or disappear. She had never imagined anyone would stand up for her, especially not someone like Adrian Romano. Around them the air in the cafe felt different now, heavier with anticipation. For the first time since she walked in, Vanessa Blake had no idea what to say next. Vanessa Blake stood motionless in the center of Briarwood Café as the quiet weight of Adrian Romano's words settled over the room like a curtain slowly falling into place. A moment earlier she had been the one controlling the scene, surrounded by curious glances and faint laughter, but now the attention felt very different. It was no longer amusement. It was expectation. Her eyes moved quickly around the cafe as if searching for someone who might break the tension, someone who might confirm that this strange reversal was only a misunderstanding. No one spoke. The soft golden lights above reflected across the polished marble floor, illuminating every expression in the room with uncomfortable clarity. Emily Carter remained beside the service counter, her hands resting lightly against the edge as she tried to process what had just happened. For years she had learned to disappear during moments like this, to shrink into the background and let the laughter pass over her without resistance. Yet now the entire room seemed to be waiting for something that involved her directly, and she had no idea how to respond. Vanessa let out another short laugh, though the sound no longer carried the same easy confidence. "This is ridiculous," she said, shaking her head slightly as if dismissing the whole situation. "You cannot possibly be serious." Adrian Romano remained completely still. His expression had not changed since the moment he first spoke. There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, no dramatic gesture. Only the calm patience of someone who had already decided how the situation would end. "I am serious," he replied quietly. Vanessa folded her arms again, trying to rebuild the authority she had carried only minutes earlier. "You cannot walk into a place and start giving orders to people you do not even know," she said, glancing briefly toward Daniel Price behind the counter. "This is not your business." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to control it. Adrian Romano took a slow step forward, closing the small distance between himself and Vanessa. His voice remained calm, yet the certainty behind it left little room for argument. "It became my business when I watched someone use humiliation as entertainment," he said. The sentence lingered in the quiet cafe. A woman near the window slowly leaned forward in her chair. The businessman who had been standing near the pastry display now watched openly, his earlier distraction completely forgotten. Vanessa looked once more around the room, finally noticing the subtle change in the way people were watching her. Their expressions were no longer supportive or amused. They were waiting. Adrian Romano lowered his gaze briefly toward Emily's shoes, still marked by faint traces of the earlier spill that had dried along the leather. Then he looked back at Vanessa again. "The request was simple," he said evenly. Vanessa's composure faltered for the first time. The silence around her made it impossible to pretend the moment had not happened. For several seconds she stood there without moving, caught between pride and the growing awareness that every person in the cafe understood exactly what Adrian Romano expected next. Vanessa Blake felt the silence pressing against her from every direction as if the entire cafe had quietly stepped closer without moving. The soft lighting that had once made the room feel elegant now seemed almost too bright, reflecting off the marble floor and polished tables so that every pair of watching eyes felt impossible to ignore. For the first time since she had walked into Briarwood Café that afternoon, Vanessa realized she was no longer the center of an entertaining moment. She was the center of judgment. She shifted her weight slightly, the heel of her shoe tapping softly against the marble as she searched for a response that might restore control. "You cannot actually expect me to do that," she said finally, forcing a small laugh that sounded thinner than before. Adrian Romano did not move. His posture remained relaxed, his hands resting calmly at his sides, yet there was a quiet certainty in his presence that made it difficult to pretend the request had been a joke. "Expectation is not necessary," he replied evenly. "Understanding is." Vanessa's eyes flickered toward the service counter where Emily Carter still stood, uncertain whether she should stay or step away. Emily's fingers curled slightly along the edge of the polished surface as she watched the scene unfold, her thoughts moving quickly through a mixture of disbelief and quiet embarrassment. She had spent years learning to endure moments like this, but she had never imagined the balance of power could reverse so suddenly. Around the cafe, the customers remained silent. The businessman near the pastry display folded his arms thoughtfully. The woman near the window leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Even the barista behind the espresso machine had paused completely, his hand resting on the metal handle as though the smallest sound might break something fragile in the air. Vanessa glanced toward Daniel Price again, hoping the manager might intervene and end the strange situation. Daniel met her gaze briefly but said nothing. His expression carried the same careful restraint he had worn since Adrian Romano entered the cafe. Vanessa finally looked back at Adrian, studying his face more carefully than she had before. The calm confidence in his expression did not come from arrogance or anger. It came from certainty. She had the sudden realization that the room was not waiting for Adrian Romano to act. The room was waiting for her. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly toward Emily's shoes again, the faint mark of the dried coffee still visible along the leather. Then he spoke once more, his voice calm and measured. "You believed it was acceptable to ask someone to kneel for your amusement," he said quietly. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened slightly. Adrian continued without raising his tone. "If the action itself is not humiliating, then it should not trouble you." The word settled into the silence with simple clarity. Vanessa swallowed, the confident rhythm of her earlier movements gone. The marble floor that had seemed like a stage minutes ago now felt like a spotlight she could not escape. Emily shifted slightly where she stood, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not have to do this," she said softly, the instinct to ease the tension rising before she could stop herself. Adrian glanced briefly toward her, his expression unchanged but thoughtful. Then he returned his attention to Vanessa once more. And once again the cafe waited. Vanessa Blake stood frozen for several seconds as the quiet weight of the room settled firmly around her, and for the first time since she had walked into Briarwood Café she began to understand that the moment was no longer under her control. The confident rhythm that had guided her movements earlier had completely vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar hesitation that felt far heavier than the simple request Adrian Romano had made. The soft lighting above continued to glow across the marble floor, reflecting faintly along the polished leather of Emily Carter's shoes where the last traces of dried coffee still marked the surface. Emily remained near the service counter, her heart beating faster than she could control as she watched the situation unfold. She had spoken only a moment earlier, quietly suggesting that Vanessa did not have to follow through with the request, but the words had barely carried across the silence before fading away. The entire cafe remained focused on the same place. Vanessa looked again at Adrian Romano, hoping perhaps that his calm expression might soften or that he might dismiss the entire exchange and leave. Instead his posture remained exactly the same as before, composed and patient, as though he were willing to wait as long as necessary for the lesson to become clear. Vanessa shifted her weight slightly, her heels tapping against the marble floor with a faint sound that echoed more loudly than she intended. She glanced around the room once more, but no one offered the reassuring smiles or quiet support she had expected earlier. The customers who had laughed minutes ago now watched silently, their expressions thoughtful, curious, or quietly uncomfortable. Daniel Price stood near the counter with his hands folded together, his eyes lowered slightly as if he understood the importance of letting the moment unfold without interruption. Vanessa inhaled slowly, the breath catching in her throat as the reality of the situation finally settled in. Pride had carried her through countless social moments before, but pride felt strangely fragile when every person in the room had already understood the fairness behind Adrian Romano's request. Her eyes drifted once more toward Emily Carter. Emily did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. If anything, her expression carried a quiet uncertainty, as though she wished the moment could end without anyone feeling smaller than before. That realization seemed to shift something inside Vanessa. The silence stretched for another long second before she finally exhaled and stepped forward. Her movements were slower now, careful and deliberate, the sharp confidence that once guided her steps replaced by something more reflective. The soft sound of her heels against the marble floor marked each step as she approached the place where Emily stood. No one in the cafe spoke. The room remained perfectly still, as though everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that carried more meaning than the simple action it required. Vanessa stopped a short distance from Emily and looked down briefly at the faint mark on Emily's shoe. For a moment she hesitated again, the old instinct to defend her pride lingering at the edge of her thoughts. Then she slowly lowered herself toward the marble floor, her movements careful and measured, as the quiet lesson Adrian Romano had set into motion finally reached its conclusion. Vanessa Blake's knees touched the cool marble floor with a softness that felt almost unreal compared to the loud confidence she had carried only minutes earlier. The sound was barely noticeable, yet the entire cafe seemed to feel the shift in the moment. The golden light from the hanging fixtures reflected across the polished floor, outlining the quiet scene in the center of the room where pride had slowly given way to understanding. Emily Carter stood perfectly still, her hands resting at her sides, unsure how to react as Vanessa lowered her gaze toward the faint mark on her shoe. The dried coffee stain that had once been a symbol of humiliation now appeared small and almost insignificant, yet the meaning behind the moment felt much larger than the mark itself. Vanessa hesitated briefly, her fingers hovering uncertainly before she finally reached for the clean cloth Daniel had quietly placed on a nearby table moments earlier. She picked it up without looking at anyone around her. The cafe remained silent except for the faint hum of the espresso machine cooling behind the counter. Emily shifted slightly, her instincts still urging her to step back and stop the moment from continuing, but something in the quiet atmosphere kept her rooted in place. Vanessa gently pressed the cloth against the leather of Emily's shoe and wiped the faint stain away with careful, deliberate movements. The action was simple, almost ordinary, yet the symbolism carried through the entire room like an unspoken lesson. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Even the customers who had watched earlier with curiosity seemed to understand that the moment had moved beyond embarrassment into something quieter and more meaningful. Adrian Romano remained standing a few feet away, observing the scene with the same calm expression he had carried since the beginning. There was no triumph in his posture, no visible satisfaction, only the composed patience of someone who believed the lesson itself was enough. Vanessa finished wiping the shoe and slowly lowered the cloth, her eyes still focused on the marble floor as she exhaled softly. The confident smile she had worn earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by a thoughtful quiet that seemed unfamiliar even to her. Emily looked down at her for a brief second before speaking gently. "It is okay," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the silent room. Vanessa did not respond immediately. Instead she placed the cloth carefully back on the table and rose slowly to her feet. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The arrogance that had once defined her presence had faded, replaced by something more reflective, as though the moment had forced her to see herself from a different perspective. Adrian Romano took a small step forward, his gaze moving briefly between both women before returning to Vanessa. The cafe remained quiet, waiting once again for the next words that would bring the moment to its final understanding. Vanessa Blake stood quietly after rising from the marble floor, her hands resting at her sides as if she was still adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of the moment. The golden cafe lights reflected softly along the polished surface beneath her feet, illuminating the place where she had just knelt only seconds earlier. No one in Briarwood Café spoke. The room held a respectful silence that felt very different from the laughter that had filled the air earlier. Emily Carter looked down briefly at her shoe, now clean again, then lifted her gaze toward Vanessa with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the entire moment. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction, only a quiet kindness that seemed to make the situation feel even more reflective. Vanessa noticed that expression immediately, and for the first time that afternoon her eye softened slightly. She inhaled slowly before speaking, her voice lower than before and lacking the sharp edge it once carried. "I did not realize how it looked," she said quietly. The words were simple, yet they carried a sincerity that had not been present earlier. Emily remained still for a moment before responding gently. "Sometimes we do not see things clearly when we are standing above them," she said. Her voice was calm and steady, the tone of someone who had spent years learning patience rather than resentment. The customers around the cafe continued to listen quietly, their earlier curiosity replaced by a thoughtful stillness. Adrian Romano watched the exchange from where he stood, his expression calm and attentive. He had not intervened again after Vanessa completed the simple act he requested, and now he allowed the moment to unfold naturally between the two women. Vanessa lowered her gaze briefly, absorbing Emily's words. The confident posture she had worn earlier had faded completely, replaced by a thoughtful stillness that suggested she was reconsidering more than just the small incident that had occurred minutes earlier. She finally looked up again, meeting Emily's eyes directly. "I should not have done that," she admitted. The admission carried quietly through the cafe, and for a moment the room seemed to exhale together. Emily nodded slightly, accepting the apology without hesitation. "Thank you," she said simply. Adrian Romano took a small step forward then, his presence drawing the attention of the room once again. He looked at Vanessa for a brief moment before speaking in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Respect is rarely taught in comfortable moments," he said. The sentence settled gently into the silence. Vanessa listened carefully, her earlier defensiveness gone. Adrian continued, his voice steady but thoughtful. "It is learned when we are willing to see ourselves clearly." The cafe remained quiet as his words carried through the room. Daniel Price behind the counter relaxed slightly for the first time since the situation began, realizing that the tension had finally begun to dissolve. Vanessa looked once more at Emily, then offered a small nod of understanding before stepping back. The room slowly returned to life as conversations resumed quietly and chairs shifted again. Yet something in the atmosphere remained different, as though everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a moment far more meaningful than a simple exchange in a cafe. The quiet life of Briarwood Café slowly returned as chairs shifted and soft conversations cautiously resumed, yet the atmosphere remained noticeably different from before. The polished marble floor still reflected the warm golden lights overhead, but now the room carried a quiet awareness that something meaningful had just happened within its walls. Emily Carter remained standing near the service counter for a moment, her thoughts still settling after the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken. She had spent years believing that moments of humiliation were simply part of surviving difficult circumstances, something to endure quietly until the day moved on. Yet today had unfolded differently, and she was still adjusting to the unfamiliar feeling of being seen rather than overlooked. Vanessa Blake stood a few steps away, her posture calmer than before, the confident energy that once surrounded her replaced by a thoughtful stillness. She glanced briefly around the cafe, noticing the subtle expressions on the faces of the people who had watched everything unfold. No one appeared judgmental. Instead there was a quiet sense of reflection among the customers, as though each person present had recognized something about themselves within the moment. Vanessa turned once more toward Emily, her voice steady but softer than earlier. "I appreciate your patience," she said quietly. Emily offered a small nod in return, her expression warm but simple. "Everyone deserves the chance to see things differently," she replied. The words carried gently through the air, and Vanessa seemed to accept them with a thoughtful pause before stepping toward the exit. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though she was leaving with more to consider than when she arrived. Daniel Price watched her walk toward the door before finally releasing the tension he had been holding since the scene began. He stepped forward and gave Emily a supportive smile. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said quietly. Emily returned the smile, though she still looked slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "I just tried to stay calm," she answered. Across the room Adrian Romano remained where he had been standing, observing the gentle return of normal life within the cafe. The quiet authority he carried earlier had never been about dominance or control. It had simply been the calm certainty that respect mattered more than status. After a moment he walked toward the counter, his steps measured and relaxed. Emily looked up as he approached, unsure what to say. Adrian's expression softened slightly when he spoke. "You showed more dignity than most people would have in that situation," he said calmly. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, humbled by the words. "I only did what I thought was right," she replied. Adrian nodded once, the smallest sign of approval. "That is usually the hardest thing to do," he said. The cafe continued its quiet rhythm around them, cups clinking softly and customers speaking again in gentle tones. Yet the earlier tension had left behind a quiet lesson that seemed to linger in the air. People would eventually leave, conversations would change, and the afternoon would continue as all afternoons do. But for those who had witnessed the moment, something simple had been made clear. Respect was never defined by power, wealth, or status. It was revealed in the way people chose to treat one another when no one expected them to care. The afternoon light outside Briarwood Café slowly softened as the sun drifted lower beyond the tall glass windows, casting long golden reflections across the marble floor that had witnessed the quiet lesson of the day. Inside the cafe, the gentle rhythm of normal life had fully returned. Cups clinked softly against saucers, the espresso machine hummed with steady warmth, and quiet conversations floated between tables once more. Yet for those who had watched the events unfold, the room still carried a faint echo of the moment that had changed its atmosphere. Emily Carter moved calmly behind the service counter, arranging a tray of freshly washed cups with the same careful precision she used every afternoon. Her hands were steady now, though a thoughtful calm remained in her eyes. The earlier tension had faded, replaced by something quieter and stronger, a quiet understanding that dignity did not come from status or attention but from the way a person chose to stand through difficult moments. Across the cafe, Adrian Romano prepared to leave. He paused briefly near the entrance, his gaze drifting once more across the room. He was not looking for recognition or gratitude. Instead his eyes rested for a moment on Emily as she continued her work, completely focused on the ordinary tasks that kept the cafe running smoothly. For a second their eyes met again, and Adrian offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement before turning toward the door. Emily returned the nod quietly, understanding that no further words were necessary. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm as cars passed along the street and pedestrians moved beneath the warm evening light. Adrian stepped out onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the quiet flow of the city, leaving the cafe behind exactly as he had found it, except for the subtle change in the way people inside it now looked at one another. Daniel Price wiped the counter thoughtfully as he glanced around the room, noticing how several customers spoke more gently than before. Even the businessman near the pastry display offered Emily a polite smile as he passed by on his way out. These were small gestures, easily overlooked in the movement of everyday life, yet they carried a quiet meaning that had not been there earlier. Emily stepped outside a few minutes later during her short break, taking a slow breath of the cool evening air. The city lights were beginning to glow along the street, reflecting in the windows of the surrounding buildings. She looked back through the glass toward the cafe where the afternoon had unfolded, remembering how easily moments of humiliation could have continued unnoticed if no one had chosen to interrupt them. But today had been different. Today someone had paused long enough to remind an entire room of something simple that people too often forget. And in the quiet space between pride and humility, a lesson had unfolded that no one who witnessed it would easily forget. Because sometimes the strongest power in a room is not the loudest voice or the wealthiest presence. Sometimes it is simply the courage to remind the world what dignity looks like.